So I am happy now to welcome historian Jeanne Theoharis, who co-founded this series with us more than 5 years ago. Jeanne is the author of some of our favorite books, including this new one, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life of Struggle Outside the South, and The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, which was also adapted for a young reader's edition, and A More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History. Oh, and I should note that The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks was turned into a documentary film that everyone needs to see and use in your classroom as well. And Jeanne will be interviewed by renowned civil rights lawyer Sherrilyn Ifill. Ifill is the founding director of the 14th Amendment Center for Law and Democracy at Howard University School of Law. And this will be of interest, particularly to teachers who are devoting a lot of time these days to teaching the Constitution and the upcoming 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And Ifill is the author of On the Courthouse Lawn. If you don't already, sign up to follow her on Substack, please. We'll drop that link in the chat. So thank you both so much for joining us. Sherrilyn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I appreciate it. I'm really thrilled to be with you tonight. I consider the Zinn Education Project really mission critical, not just at this time, but as a sustained source of learning about our history. When my daughters were, in high school, we were always looking for materials, and this resource is just so, so important. And I'm especially thrilled to be here tonight to be able to talk with Jeanne Theoharis about her latest work. So, as the young people would say, I'm a Jeanne Theoharis stan, meaning I love her work and her books. And you heard Jesse mention some of the other books she's written. I was looking around for my books and I had to go on my shelf to get The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks, which I absolutely recommend. And then I could not find A More Beautiful and Terrible History. And I was just casting about. And the reason I couldn't find it, of course, it was right next to me under my calendar. This is my favorite.
Oh.
I love this book. And if you haven't read it, especially for those of you who are educators, it's so important. And if we take those two books and we now combine it with the latest book, King of the North, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Life of Struggle Outside the South, I think, Jeanne, can I call you Jeanne or should I call you Professor?
Call me Jeanne. No,
Okay.
Jeanne.
I see a through line, right? What the through line I see is not like, oh, civil rights or what I see is you devoting yourself to telling these very important untold stories. We have had so much of our civil rights history repackaged and served back to us in some ways with the parts that are most palatable. And what I see as the through line in these three books is that you are allowing us to see and sharing with us narratives that complicate the story.
Right.
So am I wrong or am I right?
No, you're totally right. And I think what I would add to that is the other through line maybe is also, I began my career actually studying the civil rights movement in Boston. But that I think what the Rosa Parks book did for me, and then the King book does perhaps even more, is return to people and things we think we know. Because I thought I knew Martin Luther King, right? Like I knew he wasn't just dreaming. I knew, the Poor People's Campaign. These things. And you realize like how much, and really with King, it's hidden in plain sight, right? I didn't go to an attic. I didn't go like it was out there, but it was about connecting dots that we haven't connected precisely because, right, this, like your point about palatability, right? Why, with the mountain of books do we have on King, have we still Southernized him? And I would argue it's partly about it's an easier story.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we like a story of an, I think the King story, like the Parks, but even more so, is just like you fight, it might be hard, but in a country like this, right, then it's the kind of misuse of, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? Like that's a kind of, I think what Dr. King meant by that was not some sort of American progress narrative, right? Because he's
Mhm.
relentless about how, like, this myth of time, right? Time does
Mhm.
not make things better, and things are not necessarily getting better, right? But I think what looking at taking King outside of the South, right, and then all the things you see about him, right, that he's a listener, that he has this like whole personal understanding of segregation and police brutality, that he shows up for other people's struggles, right? That he doesn't just lead from the
Mhm.
front,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Shows us all these different parts of him. But fundamentally, it shows us an America that isn't just constantly improving, and that many of those liberals, Northern liberals, who were like, yes, I would like change in Montgomery, the second it was here in Chicago, here in New York, are like, no, absolutely not.
Okay, but we're getting ahead of
We
ourselves,
are getting ahead of ourselves.
and I really do want to take it slowly
Okay.
because this book is incredibly rich, and
You.
there's a lot of history here that I think, especially for the educators on, or for anyone, honestly, you're going to have to dig deeper. Although you get a lot here, and I want to make sure that we take the stages of it because um, I want to talk about not only Dr. King in the North and the particular qualities about him as a leader that you described that are actually so important and in some ways contrary to what we've been told.
Yeah.
Um, but I want to make sure that we also really deal with the complicated person and what it takes to lead in this way.
Sure.
Um, Obviously, one of the things that is very important to you in writing this book, like Rosa Parks and like A More Beautiful and Terrible History, which is, again, that's certainly about the North, but also the stories that we leave out,
Yes.
that we have decided there was this narrow brand of activists
Yeah.
when activism took many forms, was quite atomized in many ways, involved people from multiple generations
For sure.
and demonstrates a level of clarity among ordinary people about the systemic forces that they were facing.
Absolutely.
So I want to have a chance to delve into that. And then I would say I want to have a chance to delve into why you spend so much time on Coretta Scott King.
Yeah.
I think you may be the first woman to write a memoir or narrative, a biography of any of King's life.
Yep.
It might be interesting to just think about why all of them are written by men.
Yep.
And it might be interesting to think about what is missing as a result.
For sure. Uh,
And one of the things missing is Coretta Scott King as an activist,
and
um,
as his political partner,
and
right?
as a political partner. Look, why don't we just start there? Because what's interesting about Coretta Scott King's story is that she has a much more, this I did know, much more activist um, mind and experience
Oh, for sure.
before she ever meets Dr. King. She's from that troublesome county, from Perry County, Alabama, Marion, which is the place where a lot of activists were developed.
Right.
And so she's Coretta Scott is way ahead of King.
Oh,
So could you say something about that, how they met and where she was in her kind of activist development?
right. So like, thank you for starting us there because I think when we start there, we really change also where we see them and how we see them. So
Hmm.
she goes, as Natasha Beck just put in the chat, to Antioch. And she and her sister are one of the first, like Antioch is probably the most liberal college in the nation,
Hmm.
when Coretta Scott goes there, but they haven't let in black, like her and her sister are the first black students to go to Antioch in decades. And so Antioch is both this like incredible expanding experience for her. She gets very politically active. Um, but it's also a space of segregation and of the limits of Northern liberalism. So she majors in music and education. Like every education major, she has to student teach, except that Yellow Springs, which is the city in Ohio that Antioch is located in, won't let her student teach in their schools. And Antioch sides with Yellow Springs, which she's just astounded by, and says, yeah, she should go student teach in Xenia, which is sort of nearby and is a black school. And she's like, no. But then she's been protesting I mean, her classmates are protesting the Korean War. They're protesting all sorts of things. But when she goes to them to say, will you join me to go to the president of Antioch to protest this? No one will go. And so I think, and you know, this experience of both going alone, she still goes. She's like, I'm not going to go student teach there. It actually means she has to spend an extra year at Antioch because she teaches at the lab school at Antioch to get her teaching credential. And also at Antioch, in part because of this, she gets involved in the Progressive Party. People may know the Progressive Party in 1948 is running a third party challenge for the presidency, Henry Wallace, both on domestic issues of segregation and economic inequality, but also on sort of global issues of sort of challenging Cold War militarism. And so if we think about what we typically associate with Martin Luther King's last year, which is the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, Coretta Scott has that in 1948. She goes to the Progressive Party convention, one of about 150 Black people, and she meets through her Progressive Party work both Paul Robeson and Bayard Rustin. So she knows Rustin and Robeson long before she knows Martin Luther King. Okay. She then decides she wants to pursue a career, a vocal career. And so she goes to the New England Conservatory of Music, and Martin is there getting his PhD at Boston University, and they meet through a mutual friend. And at first she's not that interested in meeting him because to her, even though she is a deep Christian, for her, being a deep Christian is what you do in your life. And most of the ministers she knew were all about suits and sanctimony. And this is her words. And so she's very worried about like how narrow he might be. But they have a lunch date. They talk about racism and capitalism on that very first date. And he's smitten. And I think partly why he's smitten is because she is way out ahead of him, right? That she's had experiences. He has, you know, I think what impresses her is obviously a vision, a commitment, like a resolve to do things. He's a listener. This is one of the things, I mean, and going to your question of like, what does it mean to be a woman biographer when like almost all the other ones have been men? And to me, it's like, why don't we know that Dr. King was a listener? Because she describes him as a listener. Belafonte describes him, so many friends, but also gang members. And I'm going to get ahead of the story for one second.
Because we're coming, but we're going to spend some time
We'll come back to her. Exactly. But I think one of the things about what she will fall in love with is that he's not judgy. And yet I feel like the ways that we now get Dr. King is often kind of this like little bit of a finger wagger. And that's not like, and some sort of respectability politics kind of guy when that's really not who he is.
Well, you know, this is something that I think, you know, even when they began to have differences, Stokely Carmichael affirmed too, that and members of SNCC affirmed that King, you know, he would hear them out. You know, he would sit on the bed and let them talk. He didn't feel the need to dominate them with his, you know, alternative view. And that's a hugely important quality. And what you're getting at when you talk about this lunch, to imagine, I mean, he's a Black middle class royalty, right? His father, you know, is the pastor of a big church in Atlanta. Obviously, he's going to inherit that church. He's there at Boston University. He's on his way.
Yes.
And very often men like that in that time didn't listen didn't feel like they had
Right.
to listen,
Right.
right? To a woman. And that had to be hugely impressive for her.
For sure. And then his family wants him to marry somebody else.
That's right.
Um, and so both the fact that this is who he wants, but also they get married in 1953. She refuses to wear white not 1973, not 1993. She wears a light blue dress. It's not a floor length dress. And then if people, King's dad was a very imposing
Mhm.
man. As I mean, according to accounts, none of the king and his siblings don't really challenge. I mean, his dad is very,
Mhm.
the only one who would really challenge him is Coretta, and she gets him to take Obey out of their vows because that makes her feel like an indentured servant. Again, 1953. So both
Mhm.
that speaks to her, but
Mhm.
also that this is Dr. King's beloved in 1953. That this
Mhm.
is who he um, and so I think that speaks to kind of who they are and where, like, kind of what they're about. And I, that
We
beautiful,
we would we
yeah,
would call this a power couple now,
we call this a power couple, but also,
except
that,
that she doesn't get to actually
right.
exercise all her gifts.
But there's no Martin with, I mean, who Martin Luther King becomes is only possible because
Mm.
of Coretta Scott. And I will
Mhm.
say that a million different ways, but
Mhm.
I'll give one example, which is one of, we're going to skip ahead. Martin gets his first calling to the pulpit at Dexter Avenue. They move to Montgomery in 54. And as we know, December 1st, 1955, um, Rosa Parks makes her historic bus stand. We have the Montgomery bus boycott. 6 weeks into it, the King's house gets bombed. And the thing to remember is the Kings have had their first baby 2 weeks before Rosa Parks makes her bus stand. They have a 2-week-old baby when this happened. When their house is bombed, Yolanda is 2 months old. And Coretta manages to get her and Yolanda out safely. But of course, guess what happens that night? Both dads come to Montgomery and are like, oh no, 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 no.
Pack it up.
Pack it up, exactly. And if you're not packing it up, at least her and the baby are packing it. No, we're
Mhm.
not, absolutely not. And she's like, no, we're not going anywhere. And so both Dr. King will say the next morning, like, you're the only person who stood with me. But also
Mhm.
her, I mean, that would have been more than understandable. You have a
Mhm.
2-month-old baby. You get out safely once. You have to assume that the second time they're
Mhm.
gonna use a stronger bomb. If they'd used a strong enough bomb, they wouldn't have lived, right?
Mhm.
So you have to understand. And yet she's like, we're not going anywhere. Again, I think this also says something about Dr. King. We often talk about how because we know where the story is going to end, right?
Mhm.
How she worries about him. But from that night on, he lives with the very real and palpable fear that she could be killed. And so I think thinking about who they are as a couple, a power,
Mhm.
who they are as, like, their whatever personal politics or gender politics, however you want to talk about it, right? Like what that means, that she's like, I'm not going anywhere, and they don't go anywhere, and they is, um,
Yeah, I think that it's so important because I think we tend to keep these dates in our head and we imagine what relationships must have been like. And complicated, she is distressed by Dr. King's, chauvinism about who should be taking care of the kids, right?
absolutely.
And very often she wants to go with him on these, trips, and she is told she can't. And so there's that tension too, but it's complicated, as they say. And especially in these beginnings, this is what they're taking on. And I would say the last thing is this is a situation they walked into with their eyes open, in part because of that early bombing.
Yeah.
Like, this is not, we got into something and then it turned out it was really dangerous. They knew exactly what they were walking into very early on. And again, because of who they were, um, the story about the Marion girls, the Perry County girls, is that they were known as being the pretty girls, right? So promising young men like King would want to get a wife from Perry County. What they actually meant was it was colorism. What they meant was light skin. But in any case, she was considered very attractive and smart, and we talked about him being, a kind of middle class prince. They didn't have to do this, you
Mm-hmm.
know, right? They are literally doing this out of their conviction. And the last thing I wanted to say about just uh, tracing that line from Coretta is that Coretta, very early on, as you have already alluded to, has that international perspective.
Yes.
And so she is working on peace issues. She finally gets to do some speeches. And when I become an adult, she's working in the anti-apartheid space, and so she continues that, but she very early on had an international lens that King didn't develop until later.
And she pulls, I mean, he will say, like, when he gets the Nobel Prize, she
Hmm.
really sees this as a new responsibility for them. She
Hmm.
had been already active in the global peace movement. She'd been to Geneva around the nuclear test ban treaty. She'd been at the UN, again, calling on the United States and the
Hmm.
USSR. But she talks about the Nobel Prize as both a joy and a burden because she really feels this, and she is like, we have to be out on Vietnam. And from 1965 on, she is publicly out on Vietnam, and she is one of the leaders of the nation. So for
Hmm.
instance, in June of 1965, she is the only woman who speaks at like this first big rally at Madison Square Garden.
Hmm.
Dr. King is interviewed afterwards by a journalist who's like patronizing and like, well, did you educate her? And he says, no, she educated me, right? Like
Hmm.
she is out ahead I mean, she is leading like the nation. Like, like we often talk about King's April 4th, 1967,
Hmm.
that beautiful speech he
Yeah.
gives at Riverside, but we can see all of those themes in things she's saying in
Hmm.
65 and 66, right? And so we tend to credit, importantly, right, Vincent Harding with that speech, or
Hmm.
other
Hmm.
people, Howard
Hmm.
Thurman for King's
Hmm.
like liberation theology, and I think we miss how much Coretta Scott King is also perhaps his most important advisor, and that these ideas are coming from her as well.
And they're also reviewing his speeches, like after he gives them, right? And she's offering her
Oh,
ideas and critiques
totally,
as
totally.
well. So let's make the shift because the book is called King of the North, and at some point, I was thinking, which king are you talking about? But let's let's go with Martin Luther King because this is a book I think in which Coretta gets. I've actually not read a book besides Coretta's own memoir
Yeah.
in which she gets the kind of treatment that you're providing here. So if there is a question about like, what do we miss with the other memoirs? We miss a really full picture of what she brings to the table. But it's called King of the North, and so I want to talk about the North. And I want to begin by talking about I'm going to start with New York and Los Angeles, and then we're going to spend the most time on Chicago, as you do in the book, for lots of reasons. But I want to first just talk about the perception. What is the perception that has allowed the story of King's activism in the North to be buried? Because now this to me very much connects with a more beautiful and terrible history, because we also are trained to think of the story of school desegregation and activism around school segregation and disparities as a movement of the South because of Brown and because of Briggs and because of Little Rock and because of all of the school cases that became part of major cases or major actions.
Hmm.
One of the reasons why A More Beautiful and Terrible History is like probably still my favorite among all of Jeanne
Yeah, yeah.
Theoharis's books is because I'm from New York, right? And I was bused to school the first year, 1968. I have nine older siblings. So I'm the only one who was bused from kindergarten, right? To a majority white school in Flushing, Queens.
Okay.
And I would say majority white, maybe 60%,
Okay.
and later maybe 50%. By the time I was at high school, it was so diverse, I'm not sure I could really get you the numbers. But the point is, I lived in that period
Mhm.
when when Northern schools, in some measure, because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the fear of the potential of federal funding being cut off, began to try to make some nascent efforts. And they had largely been left out of the story. We all talked about segregation in the South, and that was the headline, but
Mhm.
not segregation in the North. And so I just would love it if you just give an overview of that conception. And then secondly, we should talk about the role of the press in maintaining that, if you will, segregated story
Yeah. Yeah.
about racism, segregation, and white supremacy in the United States.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm going to start with the press because I think there's no way to understand how
Mhm.
we get this story without um, understanding that this is the story we have of King, and particularly the ways that we see him as like a Southern minister who then discovers the North after Watts and then goes, and goes north with Chicago, is a story that is the media story of the time. And I think one of the things we want to remember is also, and again, there's great work by like Mary Duziak and other people around
Mhm.
the kind of Cold War context of the civil rights movement. But one other aspect of that Cold War context is a kind of national investment, both in the race problem being Southern and then in lifting up, as Duziak talks about, whether it's the desegregation of Little Rock, right, internationally as like, look, we're like such a self-perfecting democracy, we're just fixing our trouble spots, right? If you have also this happening from New York to Chicago to LA, this is no regional like trouble spot. This is endemic to the United States, right? And so that is not. So I think there's a Cold War investment in seeing the race problem as Southern, but there's also a media investment and a kind of Northern liberal investment, if we will,
Mhm. Mhm.
in being willing to kind of fix the South at the same time. And if we think about New York, right, what is New York's response to Brown? It's like, hey, this is a great decision, but we don't think it applies to us.
Mhm.
The superintendent of schools at the time, Theodore Jansen, basically tells his like underling administrators, like, don't use that word segregation, use separation. Um, and what we'll see, and again, I saw somebody posting about Ella Baker in the chat, right? What is Ella
Mhm.
Baker doing in the 50s? She's running the Harlem NAACP, and she's talking about the way even the NAACP is focusing too much post Brown on the problem of the South. And she's really organizing here in New York, right, to sort of lift up, because not surprisingly, Black parents in Harlem, Black parents in Chicago, Black parents in LA are after Brown are like, hey, this means my kid is going to get a better education. This is going to apply to my kid. And when that doesn't happen, we begin to see this incredible flowering of movements, again, from New York to LA. And one of the, I mean, if we really like, I mean, to me, one of the clearest places where we see the kind of fulsomeness of the Northern Black freedom struggle is around school desegregation. I mean, Black
I'm sorry, say it again.
around school desegregation,
Mhm.
right? That um, Black parents are relentless, not just right in Alabama, but in New York, but in Chicago, right? That they are going to push as hard as they can in as many ways as they can to try to alleviate the unequal education that their children are getting.
Jean, I'm thinking also that the copy, back to the press, the copy is better
Yes.
when you focus on the South, right? And also I want to be fair that some of the tactically and strategically,
Yep.
there was an effort among civil rights activists to arouse
Right.
outrage in the North about the South. That was part of, right? We all know that. We know that Freedom Summer was like, get the Northern kids to come down, and
And
then
then
Northern parents will
exactly,
worry about
attention
their
will come
kids.
back.
Like,
Yeah.
let's just be clear that the North-South piece was also strategically used by civil rights activists.
Absolutely.
But because of the nature of Southern bigotry and racism, which wasn't like if you talk to Mayor Daley in Chicago, he was a political figure, a Northern political figure that people would recognize. He didn't present as Bull Connor. He didn't present as uneducated or ignorant or, well, but in any case,
Or
there
not,
was
he
a,
was not a segregation noun forever. He's not
exactly.
saying
He's
that.
so the copy from the South was much more compelling than you needed an extra step to understand the nature of racism and white supremacy in the North. You need another step to dig in and understand the systemic. You need to understand zoning. You needed to like it got a little bit more complicated as opposed to white colored fountains. This is the bathroom you have to use, right? So the copy in the South was also more compelling, which newspapers liked and maybe even became addicted to because their readers liked it.
Right. And I think this is the thing, is their readers that like increasingly, and let me just step back for 1 minute, which is that because both kings had gone to school and come of age in the North, they already knew
Mm-hmm.
that Northern liberalism was not so liberal at home,
Hmm.
right? And so it is then when we look at Dr. King's first book, that Stride Toward Freedom, out of Montgomery, there is a section that's about Northern liberalism needing to be liberal at home and not to just rise up in outrage about something happening in Mississippi, but somebody being denied a job or a home, right? So this sense of pointing over there and wanting to fix over there and being offended, like I'm a good person. What do you mean that I'm segregating? What do you mean? Um, and so the kind of, again, what young people today would say, the kind of gaslighting nature of kind of Northern liberalism makes also it easier to focus on segregationists who proudly claim segregation, right? Um, and so there's a kind of slipperiness. There's, but I think for me, one of the things about listening to Dr. King is the ways that he's both, as you say, he is absolutely trying to get Northerners to raise up their voices against the South. But he is also in those very rooms also saying that's not enough, right? He is, and we might see this as a religious imperative too, right? This
Hmm.
notion that you don't just get to call out the
Hmm.
splinter in your neighbor's eye without the
Hmm.
plank in yours. So in so many of these rooms, right? One of my favorite, he's speaking to the Urban League,
Hmm.
the anniversary of the Urban League in 1960, and he really goes in on and basically is like, you need we need a liberalism that's actually liberal at home. That again, rises up when somebody can't buy a house or rent a house, rises up, right? So he sees a responsibility, and he also, I think, we can see also an evolution. So in those early years, we might see the kind of way he would talk to congregations wherever he is, right? Which is like your professions are different from your actions. We get to the mid 60s and he's starting to call liberalism like more like a garment or a vanity or a
Hmm.
comfortable
Hmm.
pose, right? That he begins to see, no, it's you don't care that your professions are different than your actions, right? Like he gets more disillusioned. So I'm not saying that that doesn't evolve,
Hmm.
and that there's
But what's interesting about what you said, Jeanne, you said he wants Northerners to be calling out racism in the South, but in those conversations, he is always
always,
referencing what is happening in the North.
always,
How is it then reported in like the New York Times, for
exactly.
example?
So for example, um, well, there's multiple ways. A, they don't report it. So one of the
They'll
things,
report what he says about the South.
yes, but they don't, or one of my favorites. So in 1964, California has a segregationist ballot like initiative called Proposition
Proposition
14.
14. Yeah. Hmm.
Exactly. The New York Times, Dr. King flies back and forth across 1964 to try to defeat Prop 14. It's going to basically give Californians the right to discriminate in the sale and rental of their property. That's what Prop 14 is going to do. Dr. King and many, many people across the country, and particularly in California, like a multiracial coalition, are trying to defeat this. And so King is going back and forth and back and forth. If you look in New York Times, they call it a speaking tour. They're not talking about Prop 14. So that's one way they cover it.
Mhm.
The second way is they talk about, right, his activities when they're focused on the North, very different. So there's this insane, one of the things people know, a few weeks after the March on Washington comes the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the death of the 4 young women. One thing we're a little bit less familiar with is that New York radicals and radicals across the country then decide to call for a boycott of Christmas shopping, in part
Mhm.
to sort of say this is not just the fault of a few people in Birmingham, this is a national climate. The New York Times writes the craziest editorial called Strike Against Santa Claus, where they're super angry because King has come out in support of this
Mhm.
Christmas boycott. And they're like, they basically equate boycotting Christmas shopping with the violence against like killing 4 little girls. They call it, it's unreasonable, it's
Mhm.
horrible, it's stooping to the level of the people who bombed it. It's like, it's completely illogical, but they're unhinged because basically what that boycott is saying is you can't just blame it on
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
group of people down there. It's a climate that is allowing for this kind of violence across the country. And so ignore it, and sometimes they have a
Distort.
very
Mhm.
different
Mhm.
tone and tact when that kind of nonviolent direct action is trained against them. And that will be true of the New York City school boycott, the biggest protest, as everyone in this call knows.
Yeah, I want you to talk about that, please. Jeanne, I want to come back to New York. And I want to come back to the incredible activism around school. Many of us know about the Brownsville strike in 1968, school strike in 1968, right about the year. Um, but I want you to talk a little bit about what Dr. King is doing, about the activist Martin, I'm trying to remember his last name,
Milton
who's in,
Glamithan.
yeah, that's right. Who's doing a lot of this work, and talk about how this is also kind of lost to us. Everyone can picture people standing outside Central High School in Little Rock, right? But somehow this has been lost to us. So please share. And I would just say for the teachers on here, this is just so, so important. So I'm just going to let you talk about it.
So, as we were talking about before the break, right? Ella Baker, there is a movement in New York from, before Brown, but then, particularly Black parents, like everywhere across the country, are like, this is an opportunity for us um, to get our kids the education they deserve. So we have Black parents doing all sorts of things, right? We have a protest in front of City Hall in 57. We have the Harlem Nine and Black mothers taking their kids out of school to protest how unequal they are, and these kind of school-based efforts. And by the early 60s, we began to see people just being frustrated, like again and again. You can't even get a tiny bit of change. And so Milton Glamithan, who is a minister here in Brooklyn, Bayard Rustin, who we know from the March on Washington, many organizers here in the city decide it needs to be a system-wide protest. And so on February 3rd, 1964, again, the biggest civil rights protest of the era, 470,000 kids stay out of school to protest the fact that there's not even a plan for desegregation in New York City, let alone desegregation. But again, going back to what we were saying before the break, the New York Times is apoplectic about the New York City boycott. They call it unreasonable, they call it reckless, and they call it violent. And so I think one of the other things we want to remember is that one of the criticisms that we often associate with like Black Power is actually a criticism of Northern protest even
Hmm.
before Black Power, right?
Hmm.
Um, and Dr. King is a huge supporter of the school boycott. And when we send out the notes, I will also maybe send a PDF. Dr. King actually writes a really beautiful piece in the Amsterdam News 2 months after, because there's all this controversy about it. And one of the arguments that white liberals are using is like Black parents are depriving their kids of school, and that's truancy, and that's illegal, and that's, you know, adult. The New York Times calls it adult encouraged truancy. And Dr. King is like not having it. And so he says, you know, the school boycott is so important because it exposes, and this is his phrase, the thin veneer of Northern racial self-satisfaction. It just says it right out, right? That like it makes people uncomfortable because here it is showing that school segregation is as much a problem here in New York City as the places we've been more comfortable looking at, like Montgomery or again. And so, but this is part of also a growing, I mean, so there's a school boycott in New York, there's a actually a couple months earlier, there had been a huge school boycott in Chicago. People may know, October 1963, 225,000 kids in Chicago, half of the Black students in Chicago stay out of school, the numbers equaling the March on Washington. So just to give us a sense of how big these are. And Dr.
It's also notable that, you know, the activism in New York, these are Black and Puerto Rican families and parents. And I think that's important too, to recognize that Dr. King is well aware, right, of the diversity, right, of this. Say something about that.
This was such a crazy revelation. So I stumble upon, I had no idea. So in the beginning of 1963, Dr. King invites two New York Puerto Rican organizers down to Atlanta to basically have them organize Puerto Ricans to the March on Washington. And I'm like, wait, did I miss this in other people's books? No, like thousands, if not tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans go to the March on Washington. They march with Puerto Rican flags. Gilberto Garena Valentin, who's one of the organizers, gives a speech in Spanish, not in the official program, but that day. And so then I'm like, well, how does Dr. King know these guys? And this, again, a New York story, 1959, right? Like, so one of the things that
Wait, so just stop for 1 second, because like that's something we also we cannot skip over. You just said 1959.
I just said, I know.
Because the other narrative is like King's doing all this stuff in the South, and then he turns like in 1966 after the Voting Rights Act to the North, and there he meets his Waterloo, right? That is kind of like a narrative.
Yes.
What your book emphasizes is this is the late 50s, earliest 60s that King is having these trips back and forth to California. He's spending time in New York. He's spending time in Chicago, Detroit. It's astonishing. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just didn't want people to blow past the 1959 date. This is before Birmingham, right?
Oh my God. It's before the sit-ins. I mean, yes. I mean, just one other fact, 6 million miles. He flies six, you know, so that I think there's a notion that King always leads from the front. And I think part of what the Northern story shows us is King shows, as the young people would say, he shows up for other people's struggles.
Yeah.
So one of the big battles in the North is around unions, right? That unions are both a portal to kind of advancement for Black people, but they are also a place of exclusion and discrimination. And one of the unions that so inspires Dr. King is 1199 right here in New York. He is introduced to 1199. So 1199 are the health and hospital and pharmacy workers. They get started in the 1930s by Jewish pharmacists here in the city. And from pretty early on, they're interracial. And by the 1950s, they've decided that they're going to try to organize the lowest paid hospital workers. And those are Black and Puerto Rican women who are basically doing what we might call jobs like orderly jobs. And these jobs are horrible because these women are forced to come in at the beginning of the day and clean, and then they have to come in for a second shift. And as Dr. King would say, and I love it when Dr. King is just a little bit sassy, he says, their wages are so low you can't even call them wages. But one of the other crazy things is that most of the hospitals in New York are defined as private or charities, and so you don't have the right to unionize. And so they're going to have to strike the hospital to try to get these women like a recognition, you know, like to the right to sort of be in a union, because basically a private or a charity is left out of the Wagner Act. Ooh, this is getting us in the weeds. Okay. So one of the things, so King meets with 1199 in 1959 because they're going to strike these hospitals, and he's like, call on me, count me in, right? And this is a sentiment that we see him, like, again, this showing up, like, what can I do? This is exactly what we want. And I think 1199 for Dr. King is so inspiring because they're walking the talk. They're saying, yes, we are going to build an interracial union. We're going to stand up for the lowest paid workers, and that helps like everyone. Then in 1962, they strike 6 more hospitals, and there's an organizing committee, and on that organizing committee is Rustin, is Randolph, but is also these Puerto Rican organizers. And so in many ways, one of the other stories that we, I think, miss about Dr. King is how he's constantly learning and expanding.
Yes.
So so he meets and he sort of sees this as this is not just a Black problem, it's a Puerto Rican problem. And so then it makes a lot more sense if he's met these people in 62, that in the beginning of 63, when they start to organize for the March on Washington, that it's like, yeah, we need to get Puerto Ricans on this, because they're facing this too. And then when they're organizing in Chicago, we often think about the rainbow that Fred Hampton builds, and that's really important. But that what King and the Chicago Freedom Movement are doing, a couple years earlier is laying the seeds for that, right? Because they're working with Puerto Ricans in the city, they're building sort of alliances, multiracial alliances, alliances with gangs, sort of much of the work that we sort of again associate with the Panthers.
So, I mean, I think that's the theme that's going to take us through the rest of this session, which is that Dr. King is constantly learning and adding in, right, that knowledge to his philosophy, to his portfolio, for his work in the movement. And I want to touch briefly on California and maybe use that as the conduit to talk about police brutality and swing us to then Chicago. One of the things that is absolutely left out of the narrative, and I had many of these conversations on Capitol Hill when we were trying to get the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed, to explain we are not coming with some new idea about police brutality. It was always part of the civil rights struggle. It's just the one that never got its own statute, and having to really just chapter and verse them on how serious this was. And first starting with them, like, the most polarizing figure you can think of is Bull Connor. Like, what was his job? Like it's not as though you don't know it. Who beat the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Alabama State Troopers? Like, if you actually like slow it down for even the things people know, the most famous stories about the civil rights movement, law enforcement is a huge issue. And I just think it's one of the things that's, if there ever is a lesson that is missing and that has been, in my view, deliberately erased,
absolutely,
is the centrality of the issue of police brutality, which is part of the I Have a Dream speech and part of all of these actions. And so could you talk about that a little bit, and about Watts and how that unfolds?
Right. And I think this is sadly going to be our last question. I'm getting messages sort of from Jesse and Deborah saying this is going to be our last.
Okay, you got to encompass Chicago in this answer, but we're going to get one more question because we have to ask about housing in Chicago. We just have to. So you do police brutality, and then I'm going to take it on the chin and ask the question about housing.
Okay, there we go. So I began this journey in LA. And one of the things that was such a revelation to me was I was working on the Black freedom struggle in LA, and I keep finding Dr. King over and over and over in this decade before Watts. So the story of like, he discovers the problem with Watts, or he discovers police brutality with Watts. In 1962, as people may know from the Malcolm X story, right, the unarmed Nation of Islam sort of secretary, Ron Stokes, is killed by police, and there's a huge movement in LA. But one of the people speaking out about that is Dr. King. And so that's 62. So when we Many of us know that line in the March on Washington speech where he
Mhm,
talks about the unspeakable horrors of police brutality, and he's
mhm,
absolutely talking about Bull Connor, but he's
mhm,
also talking about the LAPD. And he's also talking about his own experiences. That Dr. King, I think there's also a way, partly because of the ways that people um, get arrested now, that we think he's some sort of celebrity getting arrested, and the ways that like Dr. King has
yeah.
so much experience with like both the police impunity doing what they want
Mhm,
and outright violence, so being kicked, being choked, being half Nelsoned, right? So that when he is making common cause, when we get to
mhm,
Chicago and when he's sitting with gang members and he's worrying about and he's getting the ACLU to take testimony from gang members to bring cases against police brutality, partly he's doing that because he's also had this experience. So when he's sitting with them, it's not like I'm going to tell you what you should do and you should pull your
mhm,
pants up and not
mhm,
use violence. It's a
mhm,
conversation both about like, how are we going to challenge this, you know, racist machine, this domestic colonialism is what he's talking about. But he's also talking about the ways that the police work as enforcers in a system. It
mhm,
is not
mhm.
about bad apple cops. It is about the system of law enforcement working in tandem with a sort of segregationist machine.
Absolutely. And I think these are some of the most really compelling parts of the book when you describe, so Dr. King and Coretta Scott King go to Chicago. They decide to deal with the issue of housing segregation, and the terrible conditions in which Black people are compelled to live in substandard housing in Chicago. And they decide to live in
Yeah,
a housing project for a period of time to learn and also to dramatize the conditions in that housing project. And when they are there, they are meeting with people all the
right.
time. And to the dismay, maybe even of some of his colleagues, Dr. King and Coretta are meeting with the Vice Lords, a major gang who um, are first reticent, but then really excited about the conversations they're having with Dr. King. And this is another place where Coretta Scott King is particularly vocal and troubled about the housing conditions. And there is an incident when a baby is killed by rats
Oh,
that sets off more of this. And so if you could just, because I know we don't have time, put all of Chicago kind of into those two subjects,
right.
the housing and the meeting with the young gang members.
Right. So they move into the west side. The two by the mid 60s, there are now two huge kind of slums, right, that Black people are kind of pushed into in Chicago. Just to give us a sense, there's 1 million Black people living in Chicago by the time the Kings moved there. That's more Black people than live in the whole state of Alabama are living in Chicago. And the level of segregation is like nothing they've ever seen, and and the kinds of conditions. And the thing we want to remember is also that Chicago has incredibly developed building codes, but they're not being enforced. So this is
Mhm.
not just about slumlords. This is about the city allowing it, profiting from it, getting kickbacks from it. And yeah, one of the things about living there is people coming by and sharing all these things that are happening to them, these conditions that they're living in. And a couple weeks after they move into their apartment, a 1-year-old baby named Andre Adams is basically eaten to death by rats. And he's also malnourished. And Dr. King will say this is as much of a civil rights tragedy as the killing of Viola Liuzzo, the white Detroit woman who was killed right after the Selma to Montgomery
Mhm.
March. Um, and I think we often we also miss that about him in Dr. King's vision that that a baby being eaten by rats and malnourished in a city that could have prevented that, right, is on the same level as the Klan attacking a white woman on on a
Mhm.
Selma
Mhm.
road, right? Um, but going back to, and again, has to be, I guess, my last point is that how that's portrayed is very different, right? So the death of Andre Adams gets nowhere near. I mean, and part of the reason I can tell this story is because of the Black press. I would not have known that baby's name without the Chicago Defender. That story, and then a couple weeks later, more families come to the King's house. Their building has no heat. There's rampant rats, and so the King and the SCLC decide to make a trusteeship for that building, basically to take it's like a rent strike, and then the money is pooled, and then they fix the furnace, and they plug the holes, and they get an electrician. And how the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune cover that, they do not talk about people in Chicago in February having no heat and a baby wrapped in newspaper. They talk about this as mean and picking on an old landlord, and you don't have a sense that people are living in rats. So I think the kind of where I think I want to end tonight is back at that same place we started, which is the difficulty of seeing these kinds of northern injustices, because of the way that we've come to picture what sort of civil rights injustices looked like, right? And so what does it mean to put the death of Andre Adams in the midst of that, right, as equal to the Klan bombing somebody's house or somebody's
Yeah,
car?
and this is where we get you're not doing it like Dr. King, you're not doing it right, right?
Right.
Listen, I know we have no time, but I'm going to ask Jeanne, for those who can stay on, if you would just read one passage from the book to close.
Oh my goodness.
Do you
Wow.
have the book?
Yes. I think so. I think I'm going to read where I end, because I think, and thank you for bringing
Yeah,
that
it
in.
was. It's on page 304. It's right at the ending. It's that
Yes.
paragraph that begins, "Reckoning with this side of King is urgent," which is a plug for the book.
Yes. Be more like King, they tell activists, when King was treated as, quote, unreasonable, accused of inciting violence, relentlessly policed and harangued by the media and more moderate Black leaders. Be more like King, they tell young activists, when perhaps the greatest gift of his leadership was his embodied belief in the power of each person's action. Convinced that the systems of injustice before us did not have to stand, he insisted that we are enough to step forward, and that what some cast as unimaginable could indeed become possible. Thank you.
Thank you,
Oh,
Jeanne. What a wonderful book.
Thank you
what a
so much.
beautiful way to end. What a warm conversation, and just intellectually brilliant. So invaluable for our educators here. I can't thank you both enough for that incredible evening.